Would ask you to open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. In the first 6 chapters of Daniel, we see how the remnant of God's people could and how they did remain faithful even in captivity. Now, what's highlighted for us here in the first 6 chapters is 4 Hebrew men. They start out as young boys, and over time, of course, you get to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's quite a bit older, a mature man, has served in his positions for a very long time. But what we want to think about is that these Hebrews are no longer in the promised land. They're no longer surrounded by fellow Israelites who are believers in Jehovah, worshipers of Jehovah, but they are in a foreign land and they're surrounded by an unfamiliar culture, and paganism is everywhere. But by personal resolve and God's providential care, each of them could make a decision in their life that they would serve God and they would take actions to do His will and to honor Him in their life. When they did this, when they stood up for the Lord, when they were determined to do that which honored Him, it meant that they faced risks. There were times when even their lives, of course, were threatened. And when they went through these things, there were times when they would have to stand alone. There are other times when they had their companions with them to go through that challenge, that test, if you will. And so we can look to them as a great example for us to draw that encouragement, that strength, to see that example of how we can conduct ourselves as we are surrounded by a pagan culture. You know, Daniel and his friends here, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were young men when they were carried away to Babylon. They were not mature men. They were not seasoned in serving the Lord like maybe Elijah the prophet. When we first read of him, he comes on the scene. He's a mature man. He's a prophet of God. He had been serving God. He's not like Moses at 80 years old when God called him to lead the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. These are very young men. They are young people in chapter 1 that when it tells us about them being carried away into captivity, which we'll read about in just a little bit, that when we first read this, we may wonder, well, are they going to remain faithful? What is their condition going to be in this foreign land? And imagine being a Jewish teenager taken from a somewhat dilapidated capital city of Jerusalem, which it had fallen apart from what it had been during the time of David and even in the time of Solomon, over to Babylon. Excuse me. In Babylon, it was the most advanced city of its age. It was advanced in art. It was advanced in literature. There was splendor. There was luxury there. There's a famous gate in Babylon that probably these young men were taken through called the Ishtar Gate. They had like 100 bronze gates in the city there. The city walls were 15 miles long, the ancient sources tell us. And so it was a large place where they were. And they walked in, and how overwhelming that would have been to see those sights and to see what is going on with all the temples and modern buildings that were there. But they went into that situation surrounded by all these different things that were foreign and odd and unusual to them, and yet their faith remained intact. And you and I can have that same type of resolve, that same type of commitment, with the same result in honoring God in our lives. We want to begin here in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and see where they are taken captive into that land and what begins to unfold with their story. In Daniel 1, verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king." So here Daniel and his companions are carried away, and as we go back and we look into the original accounts of when that happened and the record of the history, if you will, of Israel, in 2 Kings chapter 24 and 2 Chronicles 36, that this was the first wave of captivity around 606 or 605 BC. And if we go back there to 2 Kings 24, 2 Kings chapter 24, let's notice here beginning in verse 1, where it gives us a little more detail. 2 Kings 24, verse 1. "In his days Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him raiding bands of Chaldeans, bands of Syrians, bands of Moabites, and bands of the people of Ammon. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken by his servants, the prophets. Surely at the commandment of the Lord this came upon Judah, to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also because of the innocent blood that he had shed, for he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah?" So it says that Nebuchadnezzar goes to Judah and he makes Jehoiakim his vassal for 3 years. So he's subservient to the king of Babylon, who is the most powerful king of that day. Think of Babylon as the superpower of the world at the time. And he made him his vassal, but then it says that he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar. In another account in 2 Chronicles 36, it says he's carried away to Babylon. And the idea is he's probably carried away as a sign of Nebuchadnezzar's power and strength, and to go and have a celebration, a victory parade in Babylon. But then he ends up being sent back, which would not have been unusual, because he ends up reigning for a total of 11 years. But here's Jehoiakim being taken away. Now, it says that all of this is happening because the Lord willed it to happen. This isn't because Nebuchadnezzar himself was determining this. He did have free will, no doubt about that, but it's God working things out in his providence, because he had told Judah time and again through the prophets, you're in sin, you're unrighteous, and this is a punishment to bring them down for that. Specifically, he mentions about Manasseh and all the sins that he had committed. So it's a punishment for them. So the nation of Judah as a whole was sinful and wicked. But then from among those in Judah, there were certain ones taken captive and transported over to Babylon. And that includes, as we're going to read in just a moment, these 4 young Hebrew boys. And they are men of faith, commitment, dedication, love, and devotion to the Lord. It tells us here back in Daniel chapter 1, that the king had decided to bring in these young children from other nations. Now, among the children of Israel, he says, you look among them and you bring some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles among them. That they were to be those young men that he thought would serve well in his kingdom. And he gives certain stipulations about them. It says, in whom is no blemish. There's no physical defects to them. As you look at them, they're physically whole, put together. It's not like they're missing an eye or they have some type of other physical defect in them. It says they are to be good looking. They're to be pleasing to look upon in a sense. And they are to be intelligent young men who are quick learners. And they have the ability to stand before the king to serve in the king's palace. That means they're not foolish young men, but they're sober-minded, they're discreet. They have a certain level of decorum about them that they would be able to serve in an important position in the king's palace and not embarrass the king or compromise the king and the workings of his government. And it tells us there in Daniel chapter 1 that they are to have 3 years of training. Now, one of the sources in history says that these young men typically started at the age of 14. So think of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah being about 14 years old and then going through 3 years of training. So at the end of it, they're around 17 years old. But it says they are to learn the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And that idea of learning that literature and language is learning the history, learning the laws, learning that language, the Akkadian language that they would use as their official language. Perhaps some other languages would be mixed in as well, as they're going to have to deal, because they have an international empire here, covering many different nations, many different languages. But they need to be able to serve in the government, and they would have to understand how those things function and what they are to do. So there's intense training over a 3-year period, including, it says, a special diet, a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank. So verse 6 then, Daniel chapter 1, verse 6, we want to see here where Daniel and his friends are determined that they're going to live by God's standard. So it says, now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who has appointed you your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine which they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. So, first of all, it tells us there in that section that their names were changed. Now, there can be various reasons for this. One thing it shows us clearly is the idea that they are subservient to the king of Babylon, that they are subjects of them because they're given new names. That often would happen with slaves, that they would be given a new name. Well, here you have an account of them being given this new name, and it could be for them to simply have a new identity, to get them to begin to think of themselves differently, if you will. Or it could be that it was easier to pronounce in the local language. And we experience that in our modern time, right? You call up support, and it's somebody over in India. You know it's somebody in India, and he says, my name is Bob. Well, we know it's not Bob. It's something else that we can't pronounce, but they use that so that we are able to communicate with him. And it could be that's what's happening with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah here. But though their names are changed, their hearts are not. What's changed on the outside and how they're identified, and they can't help that, doesn't affect what's going on in their hearts and their minds. Because it tells us in the very next verse, in verse 8, that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies. He was not going to compromise himself. The diet that they were being offered was not in agreement with what the law of Moses said was proper for an Israelite. And so they refused to eat that. They say, we're not going to have that. And thus he goes to the chief of the eunuchs and requests relief that he may have a different diet. He and his friends, of course. Well, that chief of the eunuchs initially tells him, no, I can't do that. And the reason he cites for that in verse 10 is, well, my lord the king, so Nebuchadnezzar, if he finds out that I change your diet and you look kind of puny, it's going to come back on me and I'm going to be in trouble. And so, no, I'm not going to do that. So Daniel then goes to the one who's in charge, to the steward, verse 11, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel. So he went to the top guy first, and he tells him no. Then he goes to his immediate supervisor, or immediate superior, if you will, and says, please do this for us and test us for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, compares to the others, and if you make the judgment on that, how we look. Is it good? Is it not good? Then you do as you see fit. But give us this opportunity. And so Daniel and the others are given that opportunity. One of the things that points to is that Daniel, as it says there, that God had allowed him to gain favor, sort of like Esther gaining favor. It's the idea that through them observing their character, their behavior, their demeanor, they've grown to respect Daniel in this short period of time. And so Daniel's able to get this provision for him and for his friends. Well, we go down a little bit further. It says after he saw that they looked better, that he changed everybody's diet over the same diet as Daniel and his friends. In verse 17, it says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So God blessed Daniel and his friends. Now this is in part through providence, in part perhaps through miracle, having this ability to prophesy, as later in the book we see that Daniel's able to foretell what's happening in the future based on the dreams of the king and what he revealed. But it says that they had this wisdom, they had this understanding. And the king then, at the end of the days of training, so after the end of the 3 years, he has a personal interview with these young men. And he examines them, he tests them, he's challenging them. Just exactly how well educated are they? How smart are they? How intelligent are they? How do they conduct themselves? Because the king's going to help make a decision where are they going to serve in his palace. And it says that as he is examining Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that he finds that they are far and away better, smarter, more intelligent, not only than the others who are in their class of trainees, because they wouldn't have been the only 4 being trained in this period, but he says they're smarter than the magicians and astrologers in his whole realm. 10 times smarter than them. So they stand out. Notice how God blessed them to be in this position, to be able to serve in this palace, which was a privileged position as they were there in Babylon. Now let's think about some of the lessons that we can get out of this. The first one I would like us to consider is the fact that we need to appreciate a godly youth. Now first, thinking about this, as you look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, Daniel purposing in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's portions, king's delicacies, with the wine which he drank, that he has a godly demeanor, a godly outlook on things. And the thing we need to think about is the fact that young people can be godly. Even at the tender age, if you will, of about 14. He had a godly orientation in his thinking. Daniel and his friends are great examples of that. Now again, think about these young men going from over in Jerusalem to Babylon, and what type of allurements there may have been there, and how heady it would have been that they were selected because of their physical appearance and their mental abilities. How that would go to the head of some young men. Look at me, look how good I am. And how much they might want to please those who have selected them to enter into this exclusive training program. But they don't let that get to them. They're not looking to fit in with everybody else around them. All the other trainees that may be there, I don't know if it was 20, if it was 50, if it was 100. But they're not pressured to be like everybody else around them. They don't feel that. And they're not pressured to please their masters who are over them. They don't just accept, oh, here's the food you need to eat, here's the wine you need to drink, take that. Well, I don't want to upset them and go again. I want to make them happy. This is what they've given. What choice do I have? No, they were godly as young men. And young men and women today can be godly. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 4, notice verse 12 with me. 1 Timothy 4, verse 12 says, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. That's a tall order. Thinking about being an example as a younger person to others who are believers, and by implication, he's saying to those who are older, as well as to your peers, you be an example to believers in word, the things you say, what you talk about, in conduct, the way that you behave, what they observe in you, in love, in your love for the Lord, in your love for the truth, in your love for your fellow man, in spirit, your attitude, your disposition, in faith, your conviction of what is right, in purity, in your morality. You be an example to other people around you. Young people can be godly and righteous and upright and set an example and have an influence with others around them. We see that in Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But here's the other aspect of it I want us to think about. That young people need to appreciate being raised in a godly home. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did not become godly when they arrived in Babylon. At the age of 14, they had had years of training and teaching in what was right and good. And that's why they were able to make that decision and to take those actions when they're in Babylon. They had been raised by godly parents. And we understand the New Testament teaches specifically fathers. We know mothers would be involved as well, but fathers in Ephesians 6 verse 4, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So parents need to strive to raise godly children, to teach them, have an influence on them, to discipline them, to bring them up in the way that is right and good. That's true. But young people need to appreciate when they have parents who are doing that. There are some who chafe under the idea of being restricted in their behavior, being restricted in what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. But it's a benefit and it's a blessing to them. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, remember this, 2 Timothy 1 verse 5. It says, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded is in you also. So Timothy was raised by a mother at least who was godly and righteous and wanted her son Timothy to be godly and righteous. His grandmother had an influence and helped to raise him and teach him what was right. Timothy needed to appreciate that. He was thankful, no doubt, that his mother, his grandmother, had helped him to know God. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 then, 2 Timothy 3 verse 14, it says, but you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. You see how his mother and his grandmother set him up so that his soul would be saved through Jesus Christ? In teaching him in the things of the Scriptures from childhood, from a very early age, shaping his mind and his outlook, his understanding of the world, of God, of God's plan of redeeming man, and talking about the prophets, saying there would be a Messiah who would come, and now Timothy has learned that Jesus is the Messiah, that he became a disciple of Christ, his soul was saved, and he was serving in the kingdom now. Paul reminds him, remember where you learned that. And it was from childhood. So young people need to appreciate and be grateful for a godly upbringing because it provides a foundation of stability for life. It will give you inner strength to face the trials of life. It will provide you with wisdom as you make decisions, as you have dilemmas in life. You have these choices before you. Being raised by godly parents will help you make the right decision so that you are blessed, because Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they made the right decision. And God blessed them for it. That they were at the top of their class. They were put in positions of honor and privilege. And as we go on through the book of Daniel, first 6 chapters at least, we see where one thing led to another that led to another. So young people need to appreciate a godly upbringing. But let's also think about this as we go back to Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, again in verse 8, where it says that Daniel purposed in his heart. Now, another way for us to describe that is that Daniel had made up his mind. Daniel had made a decision. Daniel had made a choice in his life. And we need to make up our mind to serve God, because serving God is simply a decision that we make. Remember Joshua 24 verse 15, choose you this day whom you will serve. It's the same decision we have, the same choice that's presented to us in life. Who are we going to serve? What are we going to do? What are we going to believe in? It's a choice what we believe in. It's a choice as to how we live and how we behave, whether or not we will serve God. Daniel had made that decision. His friends had all made that decision. And we have to remain resolved in that. When Daniel first asked the chief of the eunuchs that if he could have a special diet, and the chief of the eunuchs, the guy in charge of everyone, essentially told him, no, I'm not going to risk that, because then I might get in trouble. Daniel didn't accept that. Daniel didn't say, well, I tried, and let it go at that, and then compromise and eat a diet that would have violated the law of Moses. He didn't do that. What he did then is, well, what's the other option I have here? Well, I'm going to go to the guy that's immediately over us and see if he'll do it for us. For a trial. Let me just see what I can get done here. And so he went and he talked to him. And of course, he was amenable to that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 13, the Apostle Paul gives this admonition. Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong. And the idea is for us to remain resolved. We will face resistance in trying to serve the Lord. When we made a decision to do his will, the devil's going to try to discourage us in that decision and what path we decided to take in life. And so he'll put roadblocks before us. And we have to remain resolved. Okay, there's a roadblock there, but there's another way. I'm going to continue to do what's right. And I'm going to push and push and push. I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to be discouraged in this. It's difficult to change the norm, if you will, because it was normal for those trainees to have these daily provisions of the king's delicacies and to have that wine. That was normal. Daniel wasn't going to accept what was normal. He was only going to accept what was right. And so he remained strong in that. And it can be intimidating to approach our superiors, people who have power or control over us. That can intimidate us at times. Even for those of us who are older, it can intimidate us. Well, how's this going to turn out? Well, Daniel, for him and his companions, it turned out well. And we need to have faith that God is working in our lives, and things may turn out better than what we fear. See, fear gets to us. We begin to think of all the bad things that could unfold if I challenge the status quo, if I go up against decisions that have been made or orders that have been given by the people who are over me. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20, remember it says this. Ephesians 3 verse 20. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. See, God's able to do more than we can conceive, more than we think is possible. He's able to do that. You know, it may be that a man goes to his superior and says, you know what, I know we've got this out-of-town trip planned for the business, for the job. Can we change that? Because I've got important things at church to do that week for the gospel meeting, something like that. Can I shift that? Let's move that. Just asking, can we do that? Why not do that sometime? Or maybe it is that a young person who's involved in athletics or other activities in their schooling, that they decide, you know what? I know the game is continuing on, but I'm going to leave early. I'm going to leave at halftime because I need to go to services. That's more important than being here at this game. Game doesn't matter. And push for that. Hey, this is what I need to do because it's the right thing to do. Maybe it is you request a different shift or a different location for work because you need to get away from bad elements. There's people around you at work that bad influence, don't want anything to do with them. Well, can I get a different shift? Can I work at a different office from a different location? Maybe it is that I need more time with my family. I need more time in serving the Lord, and the current situation just isn't working. So you go and you ask, can we change things up? Because I need to do something else. I need to do what's right. We need to be willing to accept the consequences when we go and we ask for these things, when we push for these things, if you will. We need to be willing to accept whatever it is that comes, just as Daniel was. When Daniel went to that steward that was over him, he said, test us for 10 days, and after 10 days, you do what you think is right. So Daniel's saying, if you want to punish us, then you can punish us. You do what you think is right, but I know what's right. And so he was willing to accept whatever unfolded. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, it says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And maybe it is that we face consequences on the job because we've asked for things to be changed up. Maybe they look at that, well, you're not a team player. Well, just exactly where are your priorities? Well, my priorities are with the Lord. Sometimes for people in the work world, that's a foreign concept and they don't like it. Well, I'm willing to accept that. Maybe it is that I don't get the promotion. Maybe it is I don't get the bonus. Maybe it is I don't get the new position. Maybe it is that I lose my job because I've asked for this, or I've asked for a shift change or a location change. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it is that a young person goes from being a starter to sitting the bench because, well, you leave the game early. You're not committed to this team. No, I'm committed to the Lord. This team is it's just a hobby. Doesn't really mean anything. 20 years, it's nothing. Nobody's even going to remember what was happening here. So we need to be willing to accept whatever those consequences are, just as Daniel and his companions were willing to accept them. But if your actions lead to great faith and service to God, whatever sacrifice is needed is worth it. And it'll be to the glory of God. Open to number 488, please. 488. When we read in the book of Daniel, we see that God was with his people in the captivity, including these 4 young men who had an unwavering faith. He blessed them with abilities to be able to serve and be in positions of privilege. He blessed them with opportunities. But notice that it wasn't simply without reason or without cause. It's because they were committed to the Lord. It's because they had a resolve and they took action to do the will of God. So God blessed them. And God is with his people today. Even though we're surrounded by a culture that is truly foreign to us, ought to be foreign to us, a culture that is out of step and out of harmony with the will of God and with the people of God, even though we're surrounded by that, our unwavering faith will give us the wisdom and the strength we need to face the challenges we come up against, just as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had in their day. So as you look at yourself this morning as a child of God, do you see where you have compromised? You've given in, you've rationalized because, well, that's just the way that it is. And won't you repent of that? Won't you turn around? Won't you be resolved? You know what? I'm not going to go down that path any longer. I'm going to adhere to the Word of God. I'm going to stand by it. And I know there are others who are standing by it. And I'm going to take courage from that. And I'm going to understand that God is with me. And God will be with me. And there may be consequences, but that's okay. If there's sin in your life that you need to confess publicly, then do that. We will pray with you and we will pray for you. If you're not a child of God, however, if you've never made that commitment, that you've purposed in your heart to do the will of God, to serve him, to honor him, to not live according to the ways of the world, if you've not done that, then you can do that this morning. You can have that strength to face the challenges that are before you, to be in fellowship with God, to have that strength in life and the hope of everlasting life. If you will confess your belief in Jesus as the Christ, you'll turn away from your sin and you'll be baptized to have your sins washed away, then you can leave here today renewed as a child of God, strong and true and dedicated, and you'll have the brethren here to encourage you and help you as you go through life. So if you need to respond, we invite you to do so while we stand and sing.